It may seem strange to have an entire presentation on just one chapter from Rousseau's On the Social Contract, but the first chapter in Book 3 is vitally important and worth spending some time on. You might recall that, in our earlier discussion of law, we noted that the sovereign and the government are not the same thing. Here's Rousseau's initial definition of government. What then is the government? An intermediate body established between the subjects and the sovereign for their mutual communication, and charged with the execution of the laws and the preservation of liberty, both civil and political. What does that look like? This diagram can help us think it through. Remember that the sovereign is all of us assembled to make law. All of us are also subject to the laws that we make. We can't all be assembled all the time. In fact, most of the time, we act in our capacity as subjects. The government is simply a subset of the population with a specific job. Most among us will spend most of our time doing our own jobs, farming, teaching, running businesses, whatever it is that we do. The job of those among us who form part of the government is to ensure that the laws are carried out, arranging for the collection of taxes or the administration of the census, for example, and to enforce them if and when that's necessary. For instance, fining those who don't pay their taxes in timely fashion, or sending a census worker to the homes of those who don't return the census form. In addition to government, there are some other terms that we need to be familiar with. Rousseau says, "I call government or supreme administration the legitimate exercise of executive power. I call prince or magistrate the man or the body charged with that administration." So as we work our way through the rest of On the Social Contract, it will be helpful to remember that the following are some of the terms Rousseau uses for individuals who are members of the government. Sometimes he refers to them as magistrates, sometimes as kings, sometimes he uses the term governors. And then he'll also sometimes use the term prince as essentially a synonym for government. So don't let that terminology throw you. Rousseau goes on at length about proportions and the relationships among the sovereign, the subject, and the government that functions as an intermediary between them. He says, "Suppose the state is composed of 10,000 citizens. The sovereign can only be considered collectively and as a body. But each private individual in his position as a subject is regarded as an individual. Thus, the sovereign is to the subject as 10,000 is to one. In other words, each member of the state has as his share only 1/10,000th of the sovereign authority, even though he is totally in subjection to it. If the populace is made up of 100,000 men, the condition of the subjects does not change, and each bears equally the entire dominion of the laws, while his vote, reduced to 100,000th, has 10 times less influence in the drafting of them. In that case, since the subject always remains one, the ratio of the sovereign to the subject increases in proportion to the number of citizens." That's really long and drawn out, and what that boils down to is this. A smaller population can have a proportionately larger and therefore weaker government, while a larger population needs a proportionately smaller and therefore stronger government. Remember that Rousseau previously said that, in general, a small state is stronger than a large one. The same is true of governments, and at the beginning of Chapter 2, he'll claim that the more numerous the magistrates, the weaker the government. the larger population needs the stronger government because the likelihood of people having to be forced to be free is higher in a state with a larger population. Let's visualize why that is. In this example, we have a small state. When we all come together to act as the sovereign and to make law, it's likely that we'll be able to reach consensus fairly easily. There are, after all, only 10 of us. Even if we don't reach consensus and have to rely on a majority vote, the close relationships among us and the sense of ownership we feel in the decisions we make as a body will provide an incentive to follow the laws that we make. So most of the time, there just won't be much need to force anyone to be free. The result is that the government can be large relative to the total size of the population. It simply doesn't need to be very strong. And note here that even if in this case the government consists of only one person, that's still 10% of the population in this example, which is really quite high. But if we look at a state with a large population, we see why such a state needs a stronger and therefore proportionally smaller government. In this example, when we all come together to make law, each of us is just one very small part of the whole. We may not all know each other. Consensus will be difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. Reliance on majority vote will be common. Moreover, each of us will feel less ownership of the decisions we make, especially if we are in the minority when it comes time to vote. It's more likely than it is in a state with a smaller population that our private, particular will be at odds with the general will. And because we're less personally connected to each other in this scenario, there's also a greater likelihood that we'll be inclined to defy the general will to follow our own. So we'll need to be forced to be free. The result here is that the government must be stronger than it is in a small state. So it must be proportionately smaller. That is, it should be a smaller percentage of the population, though in absolute numbers it might actually have more people than the smaller state. It'll still be a smaller percentage. Okay. It's really important to note here that there is an inverse relationship between the size of the state and the appropriate size of the government. That presents us with a significant challenge, as we'll see in the next set of slides.